Well, I'll tell you, I've been really blessed being born on Catalina Island and being brought up here and raised, particularly in the boating industry. My life has been boats from the time I was a couple of weeks old, I guess. I was being taught how to drive a boat.
My dad met my mom, I don't know just when that was, but that was when he was back in Indianapolis, and she lived in Detroit. Yeah, my dad, Al Bombard, was a race car mechanic mostly. In those days back in Indianapolis, they had a driver and a mechanic that rode in each car. And he worked at Indianapolis for quite a while. That's where he got into it originally. And then later he came out to California. They contracted with Alison to use the Beverly Hills track, which was a board track. It was 2x4s on edge, and it was supposed to be the fastest track in the country. One weekend, some friends of his invited him to come over on their sailboat to the island. That was in 1919. And it's the first time he saw Catalina, and he just fell in love with it. And they went back and sold their business, and they moved over here. And my dad got into the speedboat business. There was a speedboat company here, and they had a couple of fellows at Stewart speedboats. They weren't much. They had racing car engines in them. He got involved with them and finally became the manager and then part owner in that company, and built Miss Catalina number 1 in 1921 and built number 2 the next year. And basically they were all the same. They were 30 foot long and carried about 15 people, and had Liberty World War I aircraft engines in them. The Liberty had a lot of snap to it, but they were designed to run 75 hours between major overhauls, and we'd run them about 500 hours in a summer, so we were pushing it, and so that we were working on them all the time. But I didn't ever let anybody pass me. I had boats like that Riva that we have up on the mantle there. I had boats like that racing me all the time, and I would always just go by them. I didn't romp by them. I'd just go by them, and it always egged them to come on again. My early days, my dad would get me up at 5 or maybe 4:30 and go fishing almost every day during the summertime. We'd go fishing in the morning, and he'd be back by 8 o'clock so he could go to work. Then we'd go fishing after work every evening. And we'd catch, we'd fish for sea bass. That was one of the big things that we did. We had a special spot between here and the Isthmus down at what they call Italian Gardens. And that's where I caught my big world's record, which when I was 11 years old, 1938 I guess it was. But anyway, we were down fishing that spot. My dad had the commandant of the Coast Guard with him, and he was busy talking to him, and I hooked this big fish on the last trip through this cove. You'd get right in practically on the beach, and what the sea bass would do is they'd run the flying fish in to the beach, and they'd go in there and gang up on them, and that's where they'd get their dinner. But anyway, I hooked this big, what turned out to be a world's record on light tackle at the time, fish, and fought it and brought it up, and my dad about fell overboard when he looked down in the water and he saw that thing. It was much bigger than the fish we'd been catching. You'd catch a lot of 30-pounders, once in a while a 40-pounder, very seldom a 50-pounder. But this thing we knew was really big, and he gaffed it, got it in the boat, and he opened the boat wide open coming into Avalon, and he got Joe Arno down, who was running the fish market at the time, to get the scales out and fish it, to weigh it officially, because as it was losing water, it was losing weight, and he wanted to get it as heavy as it could be. The fish weighed exactly 60 pounds, which was pretty darn good for a sea bass. Yeah, when I was a little kid in Avalon, it was a lot of fun, because I spent an awful lot of time naturally out at the speedboats. I was practicing at a very early age being a driver. I had to make my spending money. My dad told me I had to work. I was probably about 8 years old, I guess. And so I would go down, and in those days, no television, you got all your newspapers. And so they used to have what they called a paper boat that would bring the newspapers over, and they'd hit town about 7:30 in the morning. And so I'd go down, and the Examiner and the Times were the two papers that you got at that time. And then later in the day, in the afternoon, you'd get the Herald Examiner. That was the evening paper. And people gobbled those things up, and so I'd take a big bunch of papers and go out and sell them, and go back and get some more and sell them. And then as I got a little older, I earned money diving for coins. That was something that you'd go up to the steamer. The steamer would come in at the dock, and the coin divers would go out, and the people would be standing up on the bow of the boat and throwing coins and watching you go dive for them. And the big kids were always beating on the little kids, and I was a little kid. But you'd put the coins in your mouth, and you hope to come ashore with a big mouthful of coins. Later, as I got a little older, my dad hired me to keep the chrome polished on the boats and keep the sand out of the seats, so I could stay busy that way and earn a little bit of money. Okay, here we are at White's Landing. It has quite a bit of water developed back against what we call the China Wall, which is the back end of White's Landing. That peak you see right above it is Blackjack. And Blackjack and Orizaba kind of go together. But there's an awful lot of water that seems to come down off those mountains and come out. A lot of people feel that you could put a well down there and tap water that comes from mainland sources. I've heard that, but haven't seen it. Let me tell you a little bit about the mining. There used to be, I don't know if towers between the west part of White's Landing Beach, and they had a big silver mine up at Blackjack, and they would bring the ore down, and they had a concentration mill on the side of the canyon down here, and they would concentrate it and then put it on barges and take it to the mainland. And there was a pretty substantial pier here which loaded both cattle during the cattle period. There was a time that they had ranged over 4,000 head of cattle on the island, and they had the corrals down at the bottom of the canyon here. I participated in a couple of those roundups, and that was really fun. Here we are at Toyon. My remembrance of Toyon is that a fellow by the name of Keith Vosberg developed Toyon School for Boys back in 1931. They built the facility, and they had all English professors there to teach the boys. We didn't like them at all in Avalon when I was going to high school, because they all the guys came in, they had gray pants and they had blazers and blue ties on, and combed their hair. We used to play them soccer. They were very English, and we played them soccer and basketball and baseball. And we'd come down on Wednesday afternoons, and one team would go into Avalon and play in Avalon, and the other team would come down here and play down here. And so I did come down quite often and play sports against those guys. They were good. They weren't pansies. You know, we used to tell the girls that they were a bunch of pansies, but they really weren't. I remember the Cubs well. That was a lot of fun for all of us that lived on the island. My dad used to take them all fishing. He'd take Stan Hack and Phil Cavaretta and Charlie Root and all the guys out fishing. They all wanted to go fishing, and so my dad was pretty popular with them. And I was a little kid that rode along with him. I was, back in those days, I was probably 8 or 10 or 12 years old. Catalina was really a good place in February to train and work all your kinks out and things like that, because that was our rainy month and cold month. I watched the Cubs practice a lot, but I didn't spend any time with them. But it was a lot of fun to get out of school and go down and sit in the stands and watch them practice. I think cost was real low. It was like $1.25 to ride the steamer over. We had 3 steamers that I remember. We had the Catalina steamer, which was the newest, and it was built for this operation. Mr. Wrigley bought a steamer back on the Great Lakes and converted it and brought it around and through the Panama Canal. It was called the Avalon, and it was slightly smaller. It was still a big boat. The steamer originally, before the war, carried over 2,000 people, 2,100 and something. And then after the war, when it came back, the Coast Guard cut it down to 1,963 for some reason. And it would carry a full load every day. It would come in with 1,963 people. The Avalon carried about 1,500, I think, after the war. It had partially wood uh, cabin on it. Some of the superstructure was out of wood, and the Coast Guard didn't like that boat at all. And they kept chopping the payload down on it to, they finally got rid of it because it just wasn't profitable to run it. All those bands of that era coming over was really something. We looked forward to it. We met with the speedboats. We met the steamer coming in with big banners, welcome. And my dad, when he was mayor for quite a while, he'd go out in the pier and meet the band when they came off and give them a key to the city, and it was a big deal. And then we prayed the band around town, and it was quite a festive event. As the boat was leaving, I'll always remember they played La Golondrina, and they'd get up on the above the wheelhouse and play that as the boat was backing out, and that was really a beautiful sight to see and watch. You know, the casino was built really for the big band era. I remember when Kay Kaiser, Dick Juergens was always my favorite band, but Jan Garber. First girl I ever danced with was Janice Garber, his daughter. I remember my dad and Jan rigged it up where we had to dance, and they put us out in the middle and spotlights on us. And I remember it was the first time I ever wore a suit, and it was a wool suit, and they itched, and so I wore my pajamas under the suit, and I was sweating blood dancing with her out there. But anyway, I did it. Well, during World War II, the island was really affected. Of course, it took just a little while for everything to sink in, but the Maritime took over Avalon as a training facility, and this was to train the crews on these Liberty ships that they were turning out so fast. They had to take farmer boys and people that didn't know anything about the water, teach them about the water and how to row a boat and how to swim, and so they took the piers and everything and set them up to teach them. And around the outside of the casino, around the water's edge, they had several gun emplacements where they taught them to fire these cannons that they used to have on the. They used to have a cannon on the aft deck and the bow deck of those Liberty ships. At the first part of the war, when they set some fishermen, my dad with a couple of his boats up to run patrols around the island. The first part of the war, they didn't have enough Coast Guard boats or enough Coast Guard personnel to do it themselves, so they set up what they called the Coast Guard Auxiliary. In those days, that was the beginning of the Coast Guard Auxiliary, which is still in existence today. I know I went on several of the trips, and they would take one of the guys from Cap Cactus with a 30-06 and a shortwave radio. They'd put him aboard the boat, and they'd do a circle around the island, and they'd do that maybe 2 different times a day, morning and evening, afternoon. And there was a time when there was 3 Japanese submarines that were laying in. It turns out that they were working between Catalina Island, and they would lay behind the Palisades here to charge their batteries and air their boats out. And one of the boats that was going around was the Gray Gull, which was a Los Angeles County Fish and Game patrol boat. and it engaged these 3 Japanese submarines, and they had a little running battle and fired a few shells, and finally the planes came up from San Diego, and the subs went down and got away. They had just hacked out the airport up there. They had the runway and everything roughed out, and it was capable of taking airplanes in. And what they did is went up there and put pilings all over the airport, so planes couldn't land on it. And then after we kind of got the upper hand and felt more comfortable, they took all the pilings off and made it an auxiliary landing strip with planes that had problems. Yeah, it was, all the houses were blacked out, and we had people walking the streets and saying, "Hey, you got a light coming out over here and there," and so we it was different. I was just discharged out of the service. I just got back to the island, and I was walking down the front street with another fellow that just got out, Billy Breitshacker, and we were going to the show down at the Riviera Theater. And Coast Guard came off the pier, and they said, "You're Doug Bombard, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And said, "We understand you know how to get around the island at night pretty good, and we have a boat that's overdue, and we think it's in Catalina Harbor. Do you know how to get in there?" And I said, "Yeah, I can help you get in there." And so they had one of those 63-foot AVRs, and we got aboard it and went around the east end of the island and on up into Cat Harbor. And anyway, she was on that boat. They followed us back, the Coast Guard boat back, and so I met her as she came up the gangway after getting back to Avalon. Well, we got married up at the Catholic Church, and we had our reception at the yacht club. Had damn near everybody in town there. We had a lot of people at the wedding. The church was full. And then we had one of our boats, not a Miss Catalina, but one of our charter boats come in. Louis Cameron was my best man, and he also drove our boat. So he came in with the boat and picked us up and ran us over to San Pedro where our car was, and we took off up the coast on up Route 1 on the Coast Highway.
The Isthmus was great as far as living there, and as far as the being able to let my children pretty well run like they'd wanted to. They all seemed to entertain themselves more than I could do. And I think just the whole Isthmus, I've asked them, my kids, if they enjoyed living at the Isthmus, and every one of them has said yes, that they wouldn't have changed it for anything. Well, they had a lot of fun down there, that's all. Because you could just let them go, and they pretty well entertained themselves most of the time.
Well, we decided to wrap up the speedboat operation. I went in and talked to Malcolm Renton, and I said, "Malcolm, I love the Isthmus, and I think I can make a big deal out of it, something that you'd be proud of." And he said, "Well, I think maybe you could." And the Island Company and Mr. Wrigley and talked to me about it, and Mr. Wrigley said, "Well, here's our P&Ls. We've been losing money there, and we don't like to lose money. we'd like you to see if you can turn that around. I said, I'll guarantee you, you'll never lose money here again. And it was only about 5 or 6 years later when they told me that we were making more money than any other operation the Island Company had. We were originally went to work with them as employees, and then finally said, well, why don't you just lease the facilities from us and form your own company? And that's what we did. We formed Doug Bombard Enterprises and leased it from the Island Company and ran it. At Two Harbors, I had what amounted to a small community. We created a general store which had groceries, fish and tackle, parts for boats, anchors, chain. We sold everything, rope, ice cream. The general store kept getting bigger all the time. We started out small and it became bigger. We had a restaurant, was the first thing we had, and that grew like mad. We served 556 dinners a couple of times down there in the restaurant. We served over 700 people on the beach down there at some of the parties we'd put out on the beach. So we kept an active program. We had something going almost every weekend, and our customers grew very fast. When we went down there, there was a couple of hundred moorings in the Isthmus and 4th and Cherry. I started installing moorings. We had a waiting list, and I started installing moorings, and we got up to 720 moorings in all our coves. That includes Isthmus, 4th of July, Cherry, Emerald Bay, Cat Harbor. But we got up to 720 rather quickly, and that became a very good profit center.
Growing up in Two Harbors, I don't think we really knew how different it was because we were born into it, and I know that he pushed me off the dock when I was 4 years old, and that's when I started driving boats. If I wanted to get back to the dock, I was gonna drive the boat. So, I mean, we did so many things early in life that, you know, that other kids didn't do, but that's what we had to offer here, and there was a lot to offer. I mean, we were working regular jobs in the summer. I was 7 when I started working probably 4 days a week, driving a trash boat here. You know, at that time we were making, I think, 25 cents a pickup, and generous pops here would give me and my buddy a nickel, so we'd each get 2.5 cents for every pickup. So it didn't take us long to figure out that we needed to find another revenue source. So we would go into his restaurant and, you know, bag up his extra ice that he had and started selling that. And then we started selling Sunday papers, and this is the type of life that we had. The summer we worked, but we had all kinds of fun because Avalon didn't exist for 3 months. This was our world. We created all kinds of friendships, and we had 2 different worlds. We had summer and we had winter. Summer you were busy right here, and winter you went to school. So it was great. We had the run of the place.
You know, a lot of people in those days came over and they'd spend the whole summer here, or a month, whether they were from Santa Barbara or they were San Diego or Long Beach or wherever. So your friendships really were widespread and kind of exciting. You got to know people from all over, and that was kind of exciting because I noticed that my friends that lived in Avalon, they really stuck together with the people they knew, and we couldn't do that because they weren't around. Although some of those friends that we had, the good friends we had in school, caught on to what we were doing and wanted to come down here. So before they even graduated from high school, we were all down here working the summers. And so we've got a lot of friends. One friend of mine, Tom Rutter, who we started out in kindergarten together. In fact, I think we rode tricycles before that when we all lived in Avalon. And he came down and he's still working with us at Catalina Express. And this is, I'm 66, so that's how long we've known each other.
Isn't he just going to retire now or something?
He is just getting ready to retire this September. And
They
I
started
mean, he's just been
kindergarten together.
a great friend, and we've worked together forever, and he's been a big part of helping us build the Express too. And so those are the kind of people that caught on down there in Avalon and wanted to come out and join into what we were doing, not stick it out in Avalon, because it just felt a little freer, a little bit more room, and it was a lot of fun.
So when we started developing Catalina Express, it took off immediately, and my son Greg and Tim took hold of it and ran it, and we immediately started building boats. We built 8 150 passenger boats up at Westport, Washington, and now at this point we have 8 boats, but 3 of them carry close to 400 passengers, or more than 400. They're catamarans, and then we still have 4 of the 150 passenger boats. So that kind of took over the passenger transportation, which was a big boon for the island. It picked up a lot of transportation when we did that. Met Robert Wagner at the Isthmus. He wanted me to help him find a boat, first of all, and we were going to, after the summer season, I told him I couldn't leave, but we were going to go to Florida and different places and try and find a boat that he liked. And he leased a mooring from me down at Emerald Bay on the reef. He loved to snorkel on that reef. And Natalie, she really didn't like the water very much. She loved to sit on the bow deck with a big sun hat and sun, but didn't. She wasn't a swimmer or snorkeler or anything like that. She didn't really like the water too well. Although she would take their inflatable and bring their kids into the Isthmus to shop, groceries and stuff like that. In her mishap, when she slipped and fell overboard on their boat, I know exactly what happened that night. They had dinner in my restaurant. It was Thanksgiving evening, and they had turkey dinner in the restaurant. And when they're sitting there, everybody's trying to do something for them, and they kept getting bottles of champagne sent over to their table all the time. And so by the time they were ready to come back to the boat, they were a little tipsy, or quite tipsy, let's say. They got in their boat, and my restaurant manager was a little concerned, so he walked out and watched them get in their boat and get out and tie off the boat to the stern cleat and get aboard the boat okay before he was satisfied they were going to be okay. The guy that was with them that night was Christopher Walken. Natalie and him were involved in a movie at the time, and that's why he came over with them. But he was making advances on Natalie, and RJ, who was Wagner, he didn't like it, and they were arguing like mad, and she finally decided to go to bed, and so they had a aft cabin on their boat for bed. Well, she got in bed, and this inflatable kept banging on the stern of the boat, which it'll do. I've done that, and what we used to do is tie it across the swim step, and I'm sure that's what she was doing when she slipped and fell into the water, was taking the inflatable and tying it across the swim step and with some tension so it wouldn't keep banging. And I think she slipped. She had mucklucks, a long nightgown, and she luckily put on her down jacket, which acted like a life preserver. And she slipped off the boat and went out, and everybody searched for her. Everybody was out searching, and they didn't come and get me until just before daybreak the next morning, just around 7 o'clock. They came up and told me what had happened, and so I went down and I got one of our harbor patrol boats, and I figured that she might have gone into the water there off their boat, which was on our mooring 01 that would fit their boat. And so I figured the current and everything and where she might be, and I went off Blue Cavern Point about 100 yards, and there I saw a little bubble of red fabric out about another 100 yards, bobbing up just above the water, and I went out to that, and there she was hanging under her down jacket. Beautiful. She looked very beautiful in death. Catalina was the playground of the Hollywood stars for many years. It was easy to get to. Of course, people didn't have jets and things like that. That's what kind of cut us out, was when they all had their private jets. But most of them had boats in those days, or knew somebody that had a boat, and they would come over and stay on them. I bet Howard Hughes, he and Paulette Goddard were staying at the St. Catherine Hotel, and they hired one of our Chris Crafts to take them down to, I think John Ford's yacht, the Eriner, which was laying in the Isthmus. The Eriner would lay there for the whole summer, and John Ford would go back and forth in a little Chris Craft he owned. But anyway, I took him down there, and then he wanted to go to the get dropped off at the Santa Monica Pier. So I took him over to Santa Monica and dropped him off at the pier. And as he always does, he'd say, "Well, wait for us." And so we waited there for quite a while, and he never showed up and never would have shown up. And I finally came home. He was famous for that deal of getting in a plane and going someplace, and then going off in a different direction, and having a plane sitting there waiting for him for a month or so. Yeah, several times I picked Maureen O'Hara up off the St. Catherine Pier. She used to come over on the Douglas Dolphins out of Wilmington and land at Hamilton Beach and take a cab over to the St. Catherine Pier, and I would pick her up there and take her down to John Ford's yacht. the Mariner anchored off the Isthmus, and it was a lot of fun. I got her soaking wet one time, and she just loved it. I was scared to death, but she loved it, and she told me big stories of her and her family in Ireland, how they used to put a net across a harbor and bring it in and purse all the fish, and the kids would all get out there and harvest the fish out of the net, and how much fun that was. Humphrey Bogart loved Cherry Cove, and he used to come into Cherry. I don't think he had a mooring there, but he used to come in and use a mooring there quite often. Errol Flynn, he used Cherry Cove. That was a favorite spot for him. Charlie Chaplin, he had a mooring in Avalon, and he used to come over to Avalon a lot. I was on John Wayne's boat, the Nor'Wester. We were having dinner, a few drinks, and anchored off that little Indian Rock island in the middle of Emerald Bay. And he always liked Emerald Bay, and he asked me if there'd be any way that he and a couple of his friends could build some houses that wouldn't be too obtrusive up on the hill above Emerald Bay. And I said, gosh, I have no idea. We've never had anybody do anything like that. But I said, Mr. Wrigley's going to be out here in a couple of months, and I'll ask him. And so as a result of that, I asked Mr. Wrigley when he came out what he thought. He said, well, you know, they tell me that if we do something like that, we ought to do it in accordance with a master plan for the property. And he said, I've been thinking about it, and that resulted in him hiring the Bill Pryor and Associates to do the master plan for the island back in the early 70s. And John Wayne building that house never came up again because we got too involved with this master plan and all of that. John, we called him Duke, had a good friend in Ward Bond. They went to SC together and played on the football team at SC. And so we went hunting out in the island a lot. So I got to know him real well. I knew him a little bit actually before I went down there, but because he was a friend of my dad's too. But he got to be a very good friend of mine, and he used to come off the pier and he'd bang on the counter in the front of the office there and say, "Hey, Bombard, get out here." And I'd go out, and that picture you see over the window there, that was the last time he came to the island, and he came particularly to say goodbye to me. He had cancer all through his body pretty bad, and he said he was going to the Academy Awards dinner the next night, and then he was going to live out the rest of his life in his house over in Newport.
Yeah, I've never needed anything that I couldn't find on Catalina. It has everything that I ever wanted in my life. I've really enjoyed all 90 years of my life. I love my family, and I love Catalina, and I wouldn't trade them for anything. I love Catalina Island.
We inherited a black. We inherited a black 15-foot.
I want to characterize the seriousness of my dad's life with a lot of his closest friends, and this is probably the best friend he had in the whole entire world. And his name was Paul Briles. And as the youngest kid, I used to go on some of their trips. And this Paul Briles was an amazing man who built bolts for Boeing aircraft and everything. But this that I'm wearing right now was probably his greatest achievement to himself. And it's all because he got to pull a prank on his very best friend. So he staged this whole vacation and rented them 2 beachfront rooms on the most inhabited beach he could find. And he didn't know anything about it. And so Paul asked him, let's go snorkeling. Oh, okay, good idea. And so, he walks out, his trunks are a little tighter than they should be. That's how he used to wear them, just like, on Sea Hunt or something. And so he lets him get out amongst all these hundreds of people, totally inhabited beach. And he comes out of his room wearing this apparatus, blowing on his balloons, and yelling, Doug, wait for me. And he turns around and takes one look at him and just embarrassed beyond embarrassed, turns around and pretends he doesn't know him and walks away. But I mean, that's how these guys lived their life. They were serious, they did amazing things, but they lived for this kind of thing right here.